George, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Wonderful. Yes, George, you're coming through loud and clear. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final session of the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal Forum. We have two presentations for you this afternoon, so we're glad that you're here. Our first presentation is called Ambush in Coriacan Defile, Unlocking the Secrets of a Fur Trade Mystery. And it's going to be presented by George Capps. George is an entrepreneur, artist, and historian who's based in St. Charles, Missouri. His research and written works focus on the interaction between indigenous and European cultures on the Eastern Plateau between 1820 and 1860. His presentation today, I'm going to tell you, it's like forensic genealogy. It's an amazing story of true events, and George is going to make some connections that you never dreamed of. Take it away, George.
Thanks so much, Jim. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, as Jim said, my name is George Capps, and I'm the author of one of the articles this year. I really wish I could be there with you all in person, but thanks so much to Jim, Clint, and the staff journal for letting me present remotely this year. Just see if I can.
George, your audio keeps breaking out on us again. It's just going in and out.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you
go ahead
okay.
And keep, and I'll let you know if it happens again.
Perfect. Okay, thanks so much. So Coriacan Defile is a name for like.
We're losing you again, George.
Location in the Rocky Mountains. Okay, let me make sure I'm the only one. Hold on just one second.
We're not hearing you now.
Can you hear me now?
It's just we're hearing about every third or fourth word.
Let me see if I can dial into the number here.
I missed that.
I'm going to try dialing into the phone number and see if that. I'm just going to dial into the phone number and see if we can use the audio line for the. Is it at all better now?
Maybe we heard that.
let me try and go forward here. And if it continues not working, I'll try dialing in by the phone number that was with the Zoom and see if we can get the audio via the I guess the cell phone waves.
Okay, let's try it. I think we got all of that. So maybe one or two missing words.
Okay. So Coriacan Defile is a name for a location in the Rocky Mountains. We'll spend much of today talking about the story or the different versions of the story regarding the event that gave the defile its name. And because the different versions are contradictory on key points, they've generated no little controversy in the secondary literature. So we'll then discuss the two major hypotheses that historians have proposed regarding the chronological context of the event. We'll test those hypotheses against the documentary record contained in the Hudson's Bay Company archives in order to come to a definitive answer. And then we'll conclude by doing a deep dive into the etymology of Coriacan and discover that it takes us on a strange and unexpectedly global journey. So to start with a setting, we're talking about a narrow cleft in the mountains with Jocko Valley to the north in the extreme western part of Montana. And at the bottom there, you can see a photo that my wife took the last time we were passing through it. And because of its strategic location, the pass was well known to participants in the Rocky Mountain fur trade. And here are a few of the luminaries who are recorded to have traveled through it during the 1810s to the 1830s. Now, this whole article is about the toponymy of the defile. That's the study of the history and etymology of toponyms or place names. By the turn of the 20th century, it was commonly called O'Keefe's Canyon. And here the toponymical analysis is straightforward. It comes from Cornelius O'Keefe, who was a colorful Irishman, a self-styled baron who settled in the area in 1861. But for much of the 19th century, the canyon had been called Coriacan Defile after a native Hawaiian man who died there in the early part of the century. And this is the story on which we're going to focus today. Now, some people are astonished to learn that any Polynesian individuals were hanging out in Montana 200 years ago. But in fact, natives of the Hawaiian Islands played an important role in the Rocky Mountain fur trade ecosystem on both sides of the international border. And this will come as no surprise to avid readers of the journal who might remember our friend Moki's erudite article on the topic that appeared in the inaugural 2007 issue. And the reason, just to touch on it briefly, stems from the fact that the ships which supplied the fur companies outposts in the Pacific Northwest at the Hawaiian Islands to resupply before continuing to the mouth of the Columbia River. And Hawaiian men had a reputation for being expert seamen and loyal workers, so they were often hired by the companies as sailors for ships and as laborers for the interior posts.
We lost you, George.
Hello. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I apologize. I'm not sure what the technical difficulty is here, but I'll continue trying to plow ahead. And just let me know if it freezes or anything like that.
Okay, we're good.
Okay. Okay, so we're discussing the story of how a particular Hawaiian fur trade employee came to be associated with a particular geographical feature in Western Montana. There's several different versions of the tradition that have come down to us, but they share an essential outline. And the story takes place, as we've seen, in this defile between the Missoula and Jocko valleys. And what happened there? Well, a Hudson's Bay Company pack train laden with robes and other goods obtained in trade from the local Bitterroot Salish and Pend Oreille peoples was ambushed. Who was involved? The raiders who conducted the ambush were Blackfeet Indians. They were bitter enemies of the Salish. And although the Blackfeet had trade relations with the Hudson's Bay Company, they objected to the company supplying the Salish with firearms and evidently considered an outfit involved in the Salish trade to be fair game. The pack train was the target of the raid, but the only victims were 3 Hawaiian employees who were at the front of the column. All 3 were killed, including one named Coriaca. Fortunately, no one else was slain and no property was lost because the Bitterroot Salish were camped in Missoula Valley near the mouth of the defile. Some of the Indians were helping the company workers to manage the horses, and when they heard the gunshots up ahead, they immediately called for reinforcements from the camp. And in the battle that ensued, several young men who were prominent in tribal politics in later decades distinguished themselves for their heroics. A daring warrior named Red Knight charged close to the retreating enemy and had his horse shot out from under him. The Jesuit missionaries christened him Henry, which in French is Henri, which the Salish pronounced Arli. And so it's by that name that he's generally known. He eventually became one of the last war chiefs of the Salish during the waning days of intertribal conflict on the Buffalo Plains. And after he was unhorsed, he was rescued by a fellow fighter named Lodgepole. And Lodgepole's Indian name was later changed to Plenty Horses, though he's best known by his baptismal name, Victor. And he eventually became head civil chief of the Bitterroot Salish. And finally, another future Salish war leader named Adolph Redfeather was said to have played a role in the engagement. And thanks to their actions, the Blackfeet were chased off. And now we get to the first major discrepancy in the strands of the oral tradition. We're told that a Hudson's Bay Company officer was accompanying the pack train, but different versions of the story that have been recorded disagree on who it was. One says William Kitson, another Francis Hermatinger, a third Neil MacArthur, and a fourth mentions Angus MacDonald.
Hey,
In this
George,
controversy, yes? Mhm.
we're hearing you pretty good. It just barely breaks up. Maybe if you turn off your video, let's try that and
Oh,
see if,
good idea. Okay.
okay, go ahead.
Is that better?
We'll see. It might be, can't tell yet.
Good call. So this controversy directly affects the question of when the ambush took place. I have here the well-known independent witnesses to the oral tradition. These are the men who either wrote down the story they knew or else told it to an interviewer. And even though none of them was an eyewitness, they provide the raw data we have to work with. The first was John Mullen, who was doing survey work for the railroad in 1854. But his account is very brief and does not provide any clues as to when the incident occurred. Other than that it happened sometime before 1854. In 1861, a traveler named John Mason Brown stated that the ambush took place in 1849 or 1850. So his account is garbled in a number of respects, so he obviously didn't have any reliable information. The next four provide considerably more detail, and these are some of our most important sources. Peter Ronan was agent on the Flathead Reservation in the late 19th century. James Tate was an ethnographer who worked with Salish elders on the reservation in the early 20th century. And Duncan MacDonald was a Salish tribal historian. All three of them related the Indian memories of the event. And Arthur Stone, by contrast, was a Missoula journalist who recorded traditions of the old timers among the white settlers. His version of the story is kind of considered canonical and has been the most influential on subsequent writing, but all four are important. And while they generally agree in overall content, you can see their information regarding when the event took place is quite inconsistent. Ronan thought the event happened in about 1840, but he named the HBC officer involved as William Kitson, who was in the Flathead area in about 1830 and definitely would not have been accompanying a pack train there in the 1840s. Arthur Stone, meanwhile, thought the officer was Neil MacArthur, who was first stationed in the vicinity in 1846. James Tate said that Angus MacDonald was involved at least in the aftermath of the incident. He took over management of Flathead Post in 1847. So that's arguably consistent with Stone. But Duncan MacDonald, who was the son of Angus MacDonald and probably would have known if his father had anything to do with it, didn't mention his father at all, but rather named the officer involved as Francis Manninger, who was at Flathead Post in the mid-1830s. And yet Duncan explicitly dated the event to the 1840s, long after Manninger had left the area. So you don't need to remember all these details. The important point is that the primary sources are very confused and confusing regarding when Coriaca was killed. Now, to date, there are two main hypotheses that historians have proposed to resolve the puzzle based on a comparison of these traditions to statements found in the published contemporary documentary record. And the first homes in on this passage from ethnographer James Tate's version of the Coriacan Defile story. He wrote, "The party that conducted the ambush was in charge of a famous Blackfeet war chief named Sata. And after the killing, Angus MacDonald, who was in charge of Flathead Post, offered $200 for Sata's scalp. And scholars quickly noted that this seems to match a passage in the journals of the Bitterroot settler John Owen. In 1856, his trading post was visited by Sata. Owen spelled it differently, but we're pretty sure it was the same guy. He said that Sata was somewhat uneasy because a reward had been offered for his scalp some years ago by Mr. MacDonald, who had his hunter killed below here a few years ago, and he was told that Sata was the man who shot him. So obviously, this diary entry provides key documentary evidence supporting Tate's chronology. And since Angus MacDonald took over from Neil MacArthur, who was named in Arthur Stone's well-regarded version of the story, a consensus is formed among many historians that Tate and Stone were basically right, that the Coriacan Defile incident took place around 1846, when Neil MacArthur was in charge of Flathead Post and shortly before Angus MacDonald arrived. You can see one recent author of an entire article on Coriacan Defile even stated flatly that the event must have happened in 1846. But a small number of dissenting scholars have reached a different conclusion by comparing the Coriacan Defile stories with a statement made by Francis Ermatinger in an 1836 letter to his brother. And he wrote that in 1835, he, quote, lost 3 islanders, one of whom was the most faithful servant to me and had followed me throughout. Now we know these 3 Hawaiians were killed at the same time because he adds, had I been leading the pack train at the moment of the ambush, we should all have fallen with the 3 poor fellows. So that's interesting. 3 Hawaiian islanders killed by hostile Indians during the time that Francis Ermatinger was in charge of Flathead Post. Sounds a bit like the Coriacan Defile incident. Well, it gets a lot more interesting when you compare with this entry from Presbyterian missionary William Gray's journal of his 1837 trip through Montana. He wrote, quote, we came out into the plain at the pass where Mr. Ermatinger tells me he lost 3 of his men by the Blackfeet 2 years since. Now, in contrast to the Ermatinger letter, which doesn't give the exact geographical context, we know where Gray was when he wrote this. And it was precisely in the canyon connecting the Jocko and Missoula valleys. In other words, it was in Coriacan Defile. So that seems pretty compelling too. So in 2006, the genealogist Richard Malouf dated the Coriacan Defile incident to 1835 on these grounds. And Malouf's editor, Bob Bigart, adopted the same conclusion in a later book. It makes a lot of sense, but the trouble is, if Coriaca was killed in 1835, long before Angus MacDonald arrived on the scene, then it's difficult to believe he would still have been trying to prosecute the alleged perpetrator in 1856. And yet we know from John Owen that the bounty on Sata's scalp was still fresh in people's minds in the 1850s. So to resolve this dispute, we must turn to the contemporary written records in the Hudson's Bay Company archives. And this task is made surprisingly easy by the fact that Bruce Watson and Gene Barman have published incredibly useful indices that document references to Native Hawaiian employees in this sprawling array of manuscript books. And sure enough, a Hawaiian named Coriaca does indeed appear in the Columbia Department accounts between 1830 and 1835. For much of that time, he was stationed at Fort Colville, which included Flathead Post as a satellite. And significantly, the 1835 account contains a curt epitaph, killed by Blackfeet Indians. So this really emphatically validates Malouf and Bigart's hypothesis that Coriaca was killed in 1835 in the company of Francis Ermatinger. Now, strangely, the HBC records do not shed any light on the 2 other Hawaiian men that Ermatinger said were slain with Coriaca. No other Polynesian employees on the books died in this geographical area during this time. However, note that Duncan MacDonald mentioned that Ermatinger had acquired the Hawaiians at Fort Hall. We know that Ermatinger had indeed stopped at Fort Hall earlier that year. And who was hanging out at Fort Hall that summer but several Native Hawaiian men formerly employed by Nathaniel Wyeth's enterprise, including some who had famously deserted him in November of 1834. And the Fort Hall ledgers contain a circa 1837 accounting of the fates of these deserters. And 2 of them, John Palmer and Harry Pickard, are listed as having been killed in the mountains by Blackfeet Indians sometime between 1834 when they deserted and 1837 when this was written. Now, historians had previously connected the statement to a rumor Wyeth heard in December 1834 to the effect that two of his deserters had gotten into an altercation with Indians on the Deschutes River and been killed. However, Wyeth did not put much credence in the rumor, and it was never confirmed. And furthermore, the rumor's geographical context was well west of the Rockies, and the Indian village involved could hardly have been Blackfeet. So as a result, I think a better interpretation of the evidence is that John Palmer and Harry Pickard were hired by Francis Ermaninger in the summer of 1835 and killed with Coriaca a few months later before they had a chance to enter the company's account books. So this helps to resolve some of the outstanding questions regarding the event that gave Coriacan Defile its name. But our toponymical analysis is only partially completed. We know why and how Coriacan Defile got its name, but we don't know the full etymology without elucidating the meaning of Coriaca. Previous investigators had not identified the Polynesian origin of the name, and when I consulted a Hawaiian language expert, I was disappointed when he confirmed that the phonology does not match a Polynesian word or phrase. He was like, the best I can offer is that Coriaca is how modern Hawaiians pronounce the term Kodiak. And my initial reaction was, well, that doesn't help. It's not like some place in Alaska. So I looked it up, and indeed, Kodiak primarily denotes an island off the coast of Alaska. Derivatively, it's a subspecies of brown bear that lives in the area, and derivative of that, a popular brand of high-end pancake mix. So that can't be right. Or can it? My contact encouraged me to dig deeper before dismissing it out of hand as the etymological dead end I assumed it was. And when I did so, I learned that in the 18th century, a major Russian colonial outpost was established on Kodiak Island, which served as the headquarters of the Russian-American Company in Alaska from 1792 to 1806. And importantly, native Alutiiq inhabitants of the island were called Kodiaks during that time frame. It also turns out the connections between the Hawaiian Islands and Kodiak Island are well attested from very early on. And these connections were mediated by Boston-based vessels involved in harvesting otter pelts from the northwest coast of North America and selling them in Canton, now Guangzhou, in southeastern China. These ships occasionally visited Russian Alaska and frequently wintered in the Hawaiian Islands. And the Russian-American Company officer Alexander Baranov enjoyed warm relationships with several of these American sea captains. And in a few cases, he arranged to get a cut of their profits by supplying them with expert otter hunters from Kodiak Island. The Americans could then poach otter pelts from the fur-rich California coasts by laying anchor a safe distance from shore and sending out the natives in their long-range kayaks, which more easily evade the Spanish police. So as a result, natives of both the Hawaiian Islands and Kodiak Island were rubbing shoulders not only in Russian Alaska, which Hawaiian sailors occasionally visited as crew members of the Boston ships, but more importantly, in Hawaii itself. For example, in 1806, Boston merchant Jonathan Winship had over 100 Alaskan natives, mostly Alutiiq people from Kodiak, aboard when he docked Honolulu en route to Alaska from the Spanish coast where they had been poaching furs. They were mostly men, contract hunters supplied by Baranov, but a few women accompanied them. A few months later, Joseph O'Kane, who was another American captain with business relationships with Baranov, had a Kodiak girl named Barbara on board his ship when he stopped in Hawaii. And we don't know why, but Barbara was left behind in Oahu and she eventually became an interpreter in the court of King Kamehameha I. And finally, in 1817, Russia actually attempted to colonize the island of Kauai. And during the course of this abortive effort, a ship full of Kodiak conscripts stranded in Honolulu, requiring some diplomacy to get them home. We now know from the HBC records that Coriaca was employed in the 1830 to 1835 timeframe. And given what we can deduce from employment trends, he was probably in his late teens or early 20s when he signed on, meaning that he would have been born right as these early opportunities were taking place for Kodiak men to interact with Hawaiian women in Hawaii. The documents make clear that Coriaca was from Hawaii and was considered a cultural Hawaiian, yet his fellows evidently called him the Kodiak. It's speculative, but in light of everything we've seen, I think the most straightforward interpretation is that he had Aleuti blood and that his birth resulted from the dynamics we've been describing. And in my mind, this raises the interesting question of whether his Alaskan genetic heritage may have played a role in motivating his ultimately fateful decision to leave his homeland and seek employment in the Pacific Northwest. While we can't know the answer to that question, we can close the loop on the etymology of Coriacan Defile and conclude that it provides a remarkable snapshot of the true breadth of the era's nascent globalizing trends. So from St. Petersburg, Imperial Russia managed a far-flung outpost on Kodiak Island, which supplied contract hunters and Boston merchants who used them to hunt the rich California coasts for furs that were highly prized in China. And on the way to Guangzhou, they would resupply in Hawaii. Coriaca's background was somehow related to all this, I think. And when he came of age, he accepted employment from a London-based company to work in the Rocky Mountains of Montana, where he was killed by Blackfeet Indians. The early 19th century was really the first time that a story like this would have been possible. Even just a few generations before, the world was a much more provincial place. And we should also point out that there are very few toponyms on the mainland on which Polynesians left a linguistic imprint. But as far as I know, Coriacan Defile is the only toponym in the contiguous United States that has been influenced by both Native Hawaiian and Alaskan Native sources at the same time. So that completes our etymological journey, which has taken us through several fascinating periods of history, as well as around the globe. Along the way, we've laid to rest some of the controversies that have swirled in the historical literature regarding the Coriacan Defile incident. We've also generated some additional hypotheses that open interesting new angles for research into the connections between the Rocky Mountain and Pacific maritime fur trade enterprises. You may have noticed, however, that there was one nagging question that we left unresolved. If Coriaca was killed in 1835, why did Angus MacDonald issue a bounty for Sata's scalp in the late 1840s or early 1850s? It turns out that the unpublished records of the Hudson's Bay Company shed light on this question too, and I think really make clear what was going on. But for that, you have to buy the journal and read the article. So I'd like to close with just a few acknowledgements. Many people contributed to this effort. Jim Hardy was very patient in working through the editorial process with me. I can be very fastidious when it comes to wording, but he did a great job of making my convoluted prose more readable. Of course, I'd like to thank the anonymous reviewers. Lilio Solomon was very generous in sharing his expertise on the Hawaiian language. I'd like to thank Bob Bigart for his input on questions relating to Salish history. In this case, he saved me from some embarrassment by pointing me in the direction of an important primary source that had eluded most other writers. Finally, of course, I'd like to thank my dear wife, whom some of you met at the Rendezvous a couple of years ago. We'd only been married a few weeks then, but I'm pleased to report that 2 years in, she's putting up with me and my arcane research projects. So thank you so much. Thanks for putting up with the technical difficulties, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, George. That was marvelous. And do tell Mary Rose we all say hello. Does anyone have a question for George? He lays it out pretty good, doesn't he?
So I always wondered the origin of the Owyhee River in southwest Idaho. And was there a connection? I mean, I know that this was a little later in time. I know that the Owyhee River already had that name, or the Sandwich Island River before that. Have you ever found a connection there?
Yes. So one of the only other toponyms, place names in the continental United States that I know of that has been influenced by the Polynesian language is the Owyhee River in Oregon. I believe there were one or more Hawaiian fur trade employees who drowned in that river very early on, and that's how it got its name. But if you look up the article that Moki Hippel wrote in the 2007 issue of the journal, he actually talks about that river and how it got its name.
There's also a set of rapids down below Twin Falls called the Owyhee Rapids, named after that same bunch. Any other questions? All right. Well, George, we appreciate your time. Sorry we had such a goof up there, but I'm glad we got it worked out. Marvelous presentation. We certainly enjoyed it all, and have a pleasant rest of your day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, our next presentation is entitled Jedediah Smith's Search for Melish's River. And this is an article that's written by Sheri Wysong. She's an independent historian that's based here in Wyoming's Bridger Valley. She earned her BS in anthropology from the University of Utah, but a focus of her research is early cartography of the West. Wysong's examination of antiquated maps led to such articles as Fremont's Folklore, or the naming of the Green, Sevier, and Virgin Rivers Revisited, that was published in the Utah Historical Quarterly some time back. Since most of the cartographic documentation of the region resulted from the geographic knowledge gained by non-Native Americans in the early 19th century, she is also interested in the role of these explorers in the Eastern and the European development of the expanding frontier. So without further ado, I present to you Sheri Wysong.
Testing. Oh, sounds good.
Either in your pocket or here.
Okay, that should be fine. Just bear with me a minute while I call up some files here. We got 'em. So I'll just call up this map for a moment while I talk. I don't see Acrobat. Sure, I got that called up. Sorry, I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint, so I'm doing something a little different here. I'm not going to be going through a PowerPoint presentation. I'm just going to be actually trying to zoom in and zoom out of maps and use the pointer to show where I'm, or the places that I'm discussing at the moment. So where is this? So we've had to kind of do a little bit of improvising here. There we go. Okay, here I am. Where is my map now? Back to map. Okay. For those of you that were here last night, you got the gist of Jedediah Smith's Southwest expedition. And even if it may not have been all that accurate, let's turn it over. It should be a little, oh, wow. That made a difference. So we're going to go into the Southwest expedition again, and the reason that I'm sorry, let me start. This presentation will heavily discuss the Southwest expedition without some needed background, because I had to make a lot of changes to this presentation. It was way too long. And I went back through it today after making a lot of slashing to it, and it's still pretty long. So if you have to leave or don't want to leave or want to leave, don't worry, you can just do so and I won't feel bad, or not too bad anyway. So I'm going to start off with, who was Smith? And it's not, he wasn't just the product of what he did. He was the product of his upbringing and experiences as a young man. And he was a young man. What kind of person was he? Well, we've had some past discussions of his piousness, but he was a product of more than that. He was born in 1799 in upstate New York to a large family with a Puritan background. But his father had some shady dealings, and they had to pick up and move to Pennsylvania. And the family struggled to make ends meet, and Smith went to work at age 13. And these experiences created in him an ambition to succeed and a drive that was tempered by his religious upbringing, but not completely reined in when he was in a difficult situation. So he was still a young man. He was 26 years old when he undertook the Southwest expedition. And at that age, he had yet to develop the wisdom and judgment that comes from maturity, experience, and introspection. So why did he take the undertake the Southwest expedition? The basic answers have been briefly touched on by previous Smith scholars, but without the context to make them convincing, I always wondered about it, and I think I have finally come up with a context that makes sense for why he did a lot of the things he did. So we're going to go back about 10 years before the Southwest expedition. And at that time, well, it was probably the very end of the James Madison presidency, but there started to be a lot of unrest on the Florida and Georgia border. And that led to Andrew Jackson going down into Florida, which at the time was a Spanish possession. But it had a lot of British down in there, and it was causing a lot of conflict between the United States, Spain, and Britain. And when James Monroe became president, his Secretary of State was John Quincy Adams. And they decided that a good way to stop all this would be just to acquire Florida from Spain. And they set about getting a treaty to do so. So John Quincy Adams started in negotiations with a Spanish diplomat, Don Luis Onis. And not only were they going to try to settle the Florida question, but also the southwest boundary of the Louisiana Purchase, which was basically the eastern Texas boundary of Texas, and also the southern boundary of the Oregon country, which would be the northern boundary of Nueva California, which was a province of New Spain or Mexico. And the area west of that would be east of Nueva California and the Continental Divide. And it's kind of nebulous as to what the Spanish would have considered the northern border of Nueva California at the time, but it likely extended as far north as Puget Sound. So the two men began negotiations, and as background, when the European countries came and were dividing up territory in the New World, a lot of it was done by the nationality of the first people to explore and map the territory. And this is very evident in the Oregon country, where we had Lewis and Clark that explored that area, and David Thompson, who was Canadian, British. And there was discussion between the US and Britain as to who should be able to claim the Oregon territory. They never could come to an agreement, so they just decided on joint administration. And so by the same token, the area east of Nueva California and west of the Continental Divide, the eastern half of that was explored and mapped by the Spanish fathers Dominguez and Escalante in 1776. And where is my map? Here. And this map, written or drawn by a fellow named John Robinson, kind of shows how that entered in to the treaty negotiation, because he wrote, and this was incorrect, Dominguez and Escalante did not get quite this far north, but he wrote on his map, which was published in 1819, might have been written a few years prior, that the most northern point discovered by the Spaniards in the interior latitude was 41 degrees and 12 minutes north. This is the same map. It's interesting. But if you notice down here, he has put the limits of the United States. He's made this border down here on the 40th parallel. And so if we pull up the verbiage in the final treaty, what it says is the boundary line between two countries shall run to the river Arkansas, thence following the course of the southern bank of the Arkansas to its source in latitude 42 north, and thence by that parallel of latitude to the South Sea or the Pacific Ocean. So the boundary was moved up, I believe, from 40th north. That's why Robinson had it at 40th north, and this was probably one version of the map, and then it was brought up to 42nd north, and that can still be seen. The legacy of this border is still seen in the northern boundary of California, Nevada, and western Utah today. And by the reason that this was moved up was because Spain agreed to cede its northern part of the Nueva California along the Pacific coast to the United States. And by doing so, it gave the US a stronger claim to the Oregon country, or at least the coast of it. And here is the map. I just found this map the other day, and it's a pretty cool map of New Spain. And this was probably drawn just like in 1820, right after the treaty was finalized. And it's actually a census map. Here's all the numbers of people in these areas. So if I zoom in, you can see what was considered Nueva California, just this little tiny strip along the coast, and it's probably being hemmed in by the coastal range of California, but it shows it is 42 north, and all this geography here, which would be western, well, probably eastern and western Utah, pretty much. This is all Dominguez and Escalante geography. They actually did map this whole part of the country, even though some of it's a little mistaken for various reasons, but it's pretty decent. And now we'll go back to the treaty. And this is in the verbiage. The whole being is laid down in Melish's map of the United States, published at Philadelphia, improved to the 1st of January, 1818. But if the source of the Arkansas River shall be found to fall north or south of latitude 42, then the line shall run from said source due south or north, as the case may be, till it meets the said parallel of latitude 42, and thence along the said parallel to the South Sea, again, the Pacific. And there are two takeaways from the treaty verbiage. One is that they really didn't know what this looked like. And two, that the Arkansas River headed from much further north than it does. I'm sorry, that would be two. Yes, two. And three, that the importance of the Melish map in the exploration and dividing up of the Western United States. And so I will pull up the Melish map right here. John Melish was a Scottish born, and he was a cotton broker. He would travel to the US, and I guess he was an amateur cartographer because he liked to make maps of the areas where he went in the US. And then he finally decided he liked the US so much, he immigrated here, and he published the first version of this map in 1816. And I think that he was an early proponent of what would become to be called manifest destiny. that the United States should stretch coast to coast. And I think he was looking into the possibilities of how to make that happen. And he made this map, and he used other maps. All these cartographers always derived off of other map makers. This part here would be from Lewis and Clark. He's got the Dominguez and Escalante geography down here. And then he had to find information for some of these other areas. And the Spanish weren't really good about publishing the information they would get from their explorations. So he had to dig pretty hard. But he got some information on San Francisco Bay, although he has it a little bit too far north. This would be the Sacramento River coming in, and it's coming in about 38 degrees, 40 minutes maybe, and it actually comes in right dead on 38 degrees. Got that a little high, but then that might have been the information he got. And if you look at this range, at first glance, you might think that was the Sierra Nevada. He calls it the California Mountains. That is actually the coastal range. But he didn't know about the Sierra Nevada. There had been a Spanish exploration up there into the Sierra Nevada, and they called it the Snowy Mountains, and it's right here. So there's a very distorted perception of what the Sierra Nevada looked like. I kind of have to think that the description of the Sierra Nevada was probably mistakenly applied to the coastal range. And so, as I said, Melish was a man that wanted to explore possibilities. And so when he had the opportunity to make adjustments on the maps for possibilities, he did so. If you look at this river here, at first glance, you might think it was the Snake, but no, this is the Snake is mapped by Lewis and Clark. This river here is actually the Multnomah or Willamette. And in reality, it would head right here and go up to go up through the Willamette Valley into the Columbia River. But Melish felt or had reason to believe that the Great Salt Lake, which they did not know was salty at the time, that had not become apparent after the Dominguez and Escalante expedition. There must have been some disconnect, language barrier, when the Indians told them about the Great Salt Lake. They never were up there. So there was also a thought that there would be an outlet right here, that most of the water was coming in from the east, from the Uinta Mountains, which it does. And so that there would be an outlet that would go from the Great Salt Lake into the Willamette Valley, into the Willamette River, and then head on up to the Columbia. And there was also the idea that, well, and this river here, the Buenaventura, that's also a vestige of the Dominguez and Escalante expedition. And they had a little language barrier issue, and they thought that the Green River that they had encountered in the Uinta Basin of Utah was actually the same river as the Sevier River in central Utah. And so on their map, they connected them. They saw the Uinta, the Green River on one end, and then they went overland, and then they came to the Sevier River. And from what the Indians told them, they said, oh, it's the same river. And then the Indians told them, well, it flows into a lake. And so Melish said, well, we know from the Spanish explorations of San Francisco Bay, there's a great river that flows into San Francisco Bay, which of course there is. It's Sacramento. But the Sacramento flows down from the north, about from Mount Shasta through the Sacramento Valley, and then makes a big turn to the east, to the west. But he didn't know about that much. He just knew a great river flowed in from the east and didn't explore very far east yet. So he says, well, that must be the outlet of this lake. And if any of you are familiar with Sevier Lake, it has no outlet. It's an inland sea, basically, as is the Great Salt Lake. But these things were not apparent to these people from the east. The idea of a great basin where all the lakes just evaporate as water comes in and they don't need an outlet was really a foreign concept to them. And so then we have the Arkansas River, that is thought to be a river that one could sail up and then go clear to the head. And then looks like he has another river here that you could maybe portage over to and get over to here and get up into this area here. Totally fictitious, but wouldn't it be great? And you just have these little hills here, and then you can just portage over into the Willamette River or into the Buenaventura River, and you could either, sail back down to the Columbia or to San Francisco Bay. That was Melish's hypothesis, that would be something that could be looked for and actually possible. Oh, one more thing is that in order to fit in the Willamette River below 42 degrees, he had to move the Great Salt Lake 1 degree south. So he was really rearranging geography there because Dominguez and Escalante, they had it pretty accurate. It was right up in here. And so this is actually the beginning of the legend of the Buenaventura River that was been discussed by several historians since then. But there was several manifestations of the Buenaventura River that were supposed during those early 1800s. And I'm going to go to the Robinson map, back to the Robinson map. And Robinson also brought the Willamette River to clear to the east. But he says, no. The Great Salt Lake, or what they called Laguna Timpanogos at the time, doesn't run to the Willamette. There's a river called the Timpanogos River that runs to San Francisco Bay. And then he said, and the Buenaventura River runs to this lake, but it doesn't run to San Francisco, due west to San Francisco Bay. It runs to this bay down here that I'm not sure what he meant for it to be. I was thinking maybe Morro Bay. So there we have so far 3 manifestations of the Buenaventura River. And then if we go back to this map of New Spain, they didn't try to say that the Willamette River came over here. But what they did say is that, well, this lake here must come down and drain into this river, the Buenaventura River here. And then it goes into this lake. And then it runs to Monterey Bay. And so there's your 4th manifestation of the Buenaventura River that gets brought up by historians when they're talking about the exploration of the West, particularly the Great Basin. So back to the treaty, it was ratified in 1821, and I'm not even sure if Spain got a chance to ratify it because they were involved with the Mexican War of Independence at the time. And Mexico did win its independence in late 1821, and New Spain became Mexico. And Nueva California, this little strip here, along with a lot of this land here, and I'm not sure the exact boundary, that became Alto California. And the Mexicans still considered this boundary to be effective. But back in Washington, D.C., you still had James Monroe as president and John Adams as Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, I should say. And they're looking at it like, no, our treaty was with Spain, not with Mexico. And they, in 1822, sent a fellow named Joel Roberts Poinsett. And in case any of you were wondering, yes, the Christmas plant is named after him. And they sent him to Mexico City on kind of a fact-finding trip. And probably to let them know that, hey, the United States is not going to honor the Adams-Onis Treaty, as the original treaty was called. We want to negotiate new boundaries. And theoretically, or reportedly, I should say, while Poinsett was in Mexico City, he laid down a map, may have been the Melish map, but I'm gonna keep this one because it shows the borders so well. And he laid it out that the United States ultimately wants Texas. This is Texas here, and New Mexico, and Upper California. And I don't know if he meant all of Alto California, which means Upper California, or just the northern part, which would include San Francisco, possibly Monterey Bay. But he reportedly did that. And then he left back for Washington, D.C., where he was in the House of Representatives, and just kind of let the Mexicans ruminate on that revelation for a few years. So a few years later, if I got up here, I'm going to pull this one back up. A few years later, John Quincy Adams became president, and he decided to pursue this boundary dispute. And he sent Poinsett back to Mexico, this time as a plenipotentiary, that's a mouthful, to negotiate the boundaries. But at the time, Poinsett was told, just focus on Texas. That's what's really important to us right now. But with the concept of manifest destiny, and even John Quincy Adams' father, John Adams, he was probably the beginning of it. Right after the Declaration of Independence, he said, this country needs to stretch from sea to sea. And so there was probably some underlying desire and instruction to try to maybe lower this boundary, which was right here, down to possibly where you could get San Francisco Bay and maybe Monterey Bay. Both of those would have been very lucrative ports for Eastern trade. However, to do this boundary negotiation for this area, they had to have accurate geographic information. And that was a big problem. If they wanted to say, use this river as a border, well, first they have to prove it's actually there. And then they have to map it. It was the same with the Arkansas River. They tried to call the Arkansas River a border, and it ended up totally nonsense as to where it was going to be. So enter William Ashley. And Ashley was basically a politician. He was Lieutenant Governor of Missouri at the time, but he decided to enter the fur trade in 1822. I don't know, Jim, if that had anything to do with the fact that they had just quit the factory system, something to think about. But his idea was new. Instead of putting in traders and small numbers of men to go up and trade with the Indians, who were then dispersing out and collecting, trapping and collecting furs, Ashley said, hey, let's take hundreds of young American men and put them out there in the wet Rocky Mountains. And that was, well, I mean, it was probably meant to be a money-making endeavor, but I can't help but think that there was also another purpose to doing it that way. So Jedediah Smith was one of those young men. He was one of the first group that ever went up there. And he was in the mountains for 3.5 years. And then Ashley seems to have targeted him for a special purpose. And that purpose was the Southwest Expedition. So if we look at this map, we know it's very wrong. For instance, there's no Green River on here. I mean, except for this crazy one that Dominguez and Escalante had speculated on. But theoretically, the Green River would have headed up here, just east of the tributaries of the Snake River, and then headed south, and then did a little jog around the east end of the Uintas, and then head south to the Colorado. And it's not there. And the fur traders knew it should have been there. And Ashley had gone out the year before and had actually floated down the Green River and determined that this part of this map was all wrong, and he was in a position to fix it. Yeah. And, oh, excuse me, I need to back up a little bit, or actually don't, this is fine. So, and as an aside here, I'm going to make an aside here. We're going to discuss the difference between Jed Smith's journal and a memoir. So right at the beginning of, or throughout the Southwest Expedition, we know that Jed kept a journal, and we don't know if he kept a journal before or after that, but we know he kept one during. And I think he was probably told that he should keep a journal of what happened on that expedition, because it wasn't just about him going out to get beaver. There was more to it. And then after the incident up on the Umpqua River, he lost his journal, and then he recovered part of it. He recovered part of his clerk's Harrison Rogers journal. And between those two journals and his memory, he managed to, he wrote a memoir, or I should say his new clerk, Samuel Parkman, wrote a memoir of the Southwest Expedition. So sorry, I've lost my place here. Okay, so, and a memoir, as opposed to the actual journal, can be a lot different, because at that time, you're able to tweak a lot of things. You're able to tweak your actual events and tweak your reasons why you made the decisions, did the things you did, tweak your thoughts at the time. And so as a memoir, when you read a memoir, you really have to take it with a grain of salt. And what's really good to do is to go back to those original journals and see if they are consistent with what's in the memoir. Well, as we discussed last night, those original journals are gone, probably destroyed. Maybe there's one floating around down in Mexico somewhere, but we can't confirm what's in the memoir. But and it's probably mostly accurate. But if there's something in that memoir that doesn't quite seem to jive with Smith's actions, or other documents, say letters written closer to the time of the event, we can probably say that Jed was making changes here and there because he didn't want the whole or the really accurate truth to come out. So historians have pretty much, taken Smith's memoir as a Bible, but I have always kind of looked at it with a jaundiced eye. And one of the things, to reveal his true intentions in the memoir is things like he makes innumerable mentions of San Francisco Bay, but he never really says, well, I was trying to explore or find the river that goes into San Francisco Bay. And he never said he intended to go to Bodega Bay or Fort Ross, but there's a lot of clues in his memoirs and other documents that point to that intent. And he didn't really stop intending to go there until he was finally on his way north after his second California expedition. So, and Smith started to write the memoir from the beginning, but then he skipped to the beginning of the Southwest expedition. I think that's because he knew that that was the most important part of his time in the West. But he didn't give any decision for any documentation for his decision to undertake the expedition. He basically started off with, I left my partners and headed south. And he said, I just wanted to discover new areas. Well, he just joined a partnership with two other men. He had a responsibility towards his business, but he's saying, I was following my whims and dreams. There is some clues of what he might have actually been doing in his memoir. He did say he wanted to explore the seacoast. And my theory is that Smith was familiar with this Melish map, and his intent was to try to come down here and follow this river east or west. Not sure why I'm having so much trouble with that today. And then when he got close to San Francisco, he didn't really want to go to the California settlements. And he said that several times in his memoir. And I think that that's something that we can believe, that he never intended to go into what would be Nuevo California, the area west of the coastal range. I think he intended to go up and probably trap along this river, then go to Fort Ross at Bodega Bay, up the coast. And we know from another document, he probably intended to go clear up to the mouth of the Columbia. And then I have to kind of suspect that maybe he was hoping he could follow this river back, the Willamette River back. By that time, he would have known that this part of the map was incorrect too, because he had actually explored it in the spring of 1826. But there's always this hope that maybe this river actually did come this far east. So he sets out on the Southwest expedition, so-called because it's southwest of the Great Salt Lake. Now I'm going to go to the modern map. Zoom in. Starts up here about Georgetown, Idaho, comes down the Bear River down here, gets to Utah Lake, and diverts up Spanish Fork Canyon. Got some interesting theories on why he did that. Comes back around here and gets about where I-70 goes west, follows that general course, hits the Sevier River, goes up the Sevier River a little ways to where the mouth of Clear Creek is, ascends Clear Creek, goes over the rim, comes down Cove Creek, and ends up right by where I-15 and I-70 intersect. And right here, he's about at the same latitude as where the mouth of the Sacramento River would be if Melish's map had been correct, which would be about right here. So he's right on that latitude. And he goes down, he goes south a little ways. And he says in his memoir, I climbed up on a hill and I expected to see a great river flowing west. Well, dang, no river. So now his plan is kind of messed up. He wanted to be back in this earlier trip that I described where he could have, gone up the river and then up the coast and down the Willamette. That would have put him back in the mountains just about in time for the 1827 rendezvous. So he was on a timeline. And he's about right here. Doesn't quite know what to do. He keeps going south and he runs into the Beaver River. The Beaver River, this is October by about that time. The Beaver River is pretty low and he follows it a ways. If the river was high, it would come up here like this and flow into the Sevier River, then the Sevier Lake. But it's so low that it's not flowing that far north. He goes so far and it just kind of disappears on him. And so he says, well, that one's definitely not my river. Now, well, I'll just keep going south. So he keeps going south, goes over the rim of the basin and hits the Virgin River, which he called the Adams River after John Quincy Adams, who was then president. And he says, well, is this my river? And he tries to follow it, gets stopped by the Virgin River Gorge, goes up the Santa Clara River where he meets the Paiutes that supposedly were eating grasshoppers and grubs in the movie last night. They had a really nice garden. They were eating pumpkins and corn, which his men really appreciated because by this time they're getting kind of hungry. And they probably told him that you're on a tributary of the Colorado River. So I think at this point, and let's go back to this map here, that maybe he was thinking, well, if I just keep going south, I can hit the Colorado River. And he has to be either on a river or on the foothills of mountains. He needs water. And he knows that this is a big desert out here. So if he's on the foothills of the mountains, there's streams coming down, there's springs there usually, or he can find a river to follow. So I'm thinking he thought, well, if I can just go down the Colorado to about where the Gila River is, I can get over to these mountains, and these are big mountains as portrayed on the map. And they ought to have water coming down. There's probably lots of beaver along here. And I'll just trap my way back up to where the river I'm trying to find is, the mouth of San Francisco Bay. So he keeps going south. And he diverts around the Virgin River Gorge, gets back on the Virgin River, and gets to the mouth of the Muddy River, where there's Paiute Indians, more Paiutes. And maybe he told them his plan, and they might have told him, good plan, but you got this big canyon here that's going to cause you some problems with your horses, unless they're really good swimmers. So he meets a couple of Mojave Indians that are up here trading, and they're saying, well, we can tell you how to get down to where you can follow the river. And if you follow it down, excuse me, to the Gila River down here, you can spend your winter down here, because at this point he was running out of everything. You can trap beaver, it'll be nice and warm, and you'll be good. And so Smith is like, oh, what's not to like? Well, this trip down the rim of Black Canyon turned out to be pretty nasty. And by the time he gets to the Mojave villages, he's lost more horses and he's in bad shape. He really can't afford to go down to the Gila. He needs more horses, he needs supplies, and he finds out that the Mexican settlements, and he's still calling them Spanish, are just to the west. And there's a Mojave Trail that goes across there. It's November, so it's not really miserably hot like it can be in the Mojave. And he's got a couple of Indians to guide him across. So he says, well, I got to go to California, no choice. California being the area on this side of the Coast Ranges. Because technically he is in Alta California the whole time. So he finds the guides guide him to springs across here. At some point they desert him, and he finds the Mojave River, which is a lot like the Beaver River. It is late in the season. It's not flowing well. He's finding water here and there, so he calls it the Intermittent River, makes it up to the head at Cajon Pass, crosses the pass, gets to San Bernardino, and horses and cows galore, just like in the movie last night. So he's able to get a few horses, and now he has to go over to the mission to try to find more supplies. And he gets over to San Gabriel. He's treated very kindly there. But Governor Echeandia is down here in San Diego, and he hears about these Americans that have come overland into California, and he's not happy. And he orders Smith detained, and Smith is detained for several months. While Echeandia questions him, what are you doing here? Why did you come here? And Smith's like, I'm just looking for beaver. No big deal here. But Echeandia rightly doesn't really believe him, but he also looks at Smith's maps. What are you doing mapping this area? And Smith said, oh, just for my own purposes, nothing, no big deal. And so finally, Echeandia lets him go. He's now several months behind schedule, considering that he wasn't able to find his river to get over across here and up. He might still be able, though, to find the mouth of San Francisco Bay or Sacramento River. And if he can only go north up here to San Francisco Bay, and if we go back here to the Melish map, that looks like that should be fairly easy. Looks like there's a nice big valley here. Where's San Diego? Somewhere, oh, I'm way too far south. San Diego, just, you know, truck up this nice valley. He could probably go up the foothills of these mountains, be trapping beaver along the way, and get up to here, and then hopefully find his river and head back. But Jedediah says, no, go back the way you came. And that was in the movie yesterday. But go back over and go home and don't come back. So Smith goes back over Cajon Pass, and then he kind of figures he's out of California. Yeah, it was evident that, you know, this is Mexican territory, but he was probably aware that there was the treaty was going to be renegotiated. Until it was, this is no man's land. So he gets over Cajon Pass and he figures, well, I'm out of Mexican territory. Now I'm going to go the way I want, and I want to go north. I don't want to go back over to the Colorado River. And so he's wandering around the Mojave Desert here, not sure which way to go. And he runs into some Indians and he says, well, I want to go where I can have water and hopefully get beaver. So they direct him over to Tehachapi Pass and say, here, go head on up the Sierra Nevada. And so they did, and they're stopping and trapping along the way. Just very successful trapping. They're quite happy. And they're hemmed in. They can see that they've got a huge mountain preventing them from going east, but they're probably not that worried about it if Smith was familiar with the Melish map, because, hey, this is where he's behind this little mountain range here, and it's going to end shortly. So they go up, 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 and there's no end to the mountain, and there's no river flowing east. And so his next idea is, well, if I can just explore the latitude of the mouth of the river that flows into San Francisco Bay, there's at least a opportunity to claim the area, and possibly as far west as San Francisco Bay. So he gets up here to where Melish has the mouth of the Sacramento, and he's at the south end of, or the South Fork of the American River. And by this time it's May. The weather's pretty nice down here in the valley, but there's still a lot of snow up here on the Sierra Nevada. And they said, well, nope, got to cross right here. This is right where I want to be. This is the exact latitude where we need to be. And the group all starts up. They start to lose horses like crazy. There's a lot of snow. They go a lot further than is really practical before they finally give up and say, oh, okay, got to go back. And so then Smith is flummoxed. He doesn't know what to do. He has to get back to the rendezvous. There's no way he can, there's no way he can be successful at his goal of exploring this area and get back to the rendezvous in time unless he can maybe find a way to get up over here, leave his men behind so that he can move faster, leave most of the men behind, and he can move faster and with a couple of men get back across to the rendezvous and let everybody know that, hey, we're all okay, and some other objectives, which I will get to in a minute. And the reason I'm pretty sure of this is, why would you just why would you try so hard to get up over Echo Summit or this along here when it was so obvious it was going to be, once it got obvious it was too snowy, just turn back. He had a lot of north from the rendezvous here before he really had to turn east. And had he kept going north, if he'd even gone to the South Fork or the North Fork of the American River, he would have gone up over Donner Pass, which is lower than Echo Summit. Had he gone up here to the Feather River and tried to ascend it, that would have been Beckworth Pass, which is, I think, one of the, I think it's probably the lowest pass in the Sierras that is actually paved that you can drive over. If you look at the geography of the Sierras, it's really interesting. It goes up, really steep until you hit Mount Whitney. And then as you go north, the altitude of the passes go down. So he wouldn't have known that at the time, but common sense says, just keep heading in the direction I need to go. The snow is going to melt. I'll find a pass I can get over, or I'll come around the actual edge of the mountain. No, he had to cross here. So, and he had to do it in time to be to the rendezvous. So he says, well, let's take my men back to the Stanislaus. He called it the Apple Mini or something like that. And he said the Indians here are quite friendly, and that's because they had a lot of association with the mission over here in San Jose. And I'm going to take 2 men and a few horses, and we're going to get up over the mountain, and then we're going to head east. So he does that, leaves his men behind, except for 2. They head up over. And I think they lost a couple more horses heading over, finally get over and end up here at Walker Lake. They made it so far. And he's right on the right latitude of where he thinks he needs to be. And he pretty much stays on that latitude all the way over. Until he gets to about here in eastern Nevada. And then they have a real dry spell where they can't find any water. They finally find some in Spring Valley, right about on I-50, present day I-50. They follow I-50 up Spring Valley and head over Sacramento Pass, and that drops them into Snake Valley. And here they have lots of water, too much water because Smith lost a horse in a marsh, in the Gandy Salt Marsh. But they probably felt like this was the place to turn north. You know, they could have gone north, you know, through any of these ranges of the Basin and Range province, but no, they stayed right on this latitude the whole way. So they go up to Snake Valley and they're having a great time, lots of water, no problem. Getting pretty hot, late June. And boy, they hit the Great Salt Lake Desert and they were in big trouble there. They finally get about to here and Smith, and they are thirsty. And Smith gets out his scope and he sees, I believe this is Deseret Peak. He sees snow on top of it. He says, just got to make that 40 miles in the heat with no water. And that's the point in the movie yesterday where, was it Goebel that was, that had to be left behind and then Smith had to go back for him? Was it Evans? Okay. And so then he goes up here. I believe there's a little monument on this point there. That's what someone told me. And around the Great Salt Lake and then up and over and to the rendezvous. He finally made it. And so why was it so important to get to the rendezvous in time? I mean, had they gotten there a few weeks later after everyone had dispersed, everyone would have been worried about them. But once they showed up, word would have gotten around that everything was fine and everything should have been fine. Well, I think the reason he had to be to the rendezvous when he did was, one, he needed to get word back to St. Louis as to what he found. And that is evident in the letter that he wrote to William Clark. Two, he needed to pick up all the extra supplies, including a cannon that Ashley had sent to the rendezvous. And now it kind of appears evident that Smith and Ashley had planned a two-part expedition, and one that would allow Smith to explore the coast and find an outpost or a port, a potential Pacific port, and two, and then to find a way back and then overland, and then to take supplies, including a cannon, back to this outpost. And that is probably the reason why leaving his men behind seemed like a reasonable option at the time. He was planning to come back anyway. So, well, the cannon was a no-go because he had to go back the same way as he had gone before, down through here, down the Virgin to the Mojave Village and try and cross the Colorado again. There was no way they were going to get a cannon across the Colorado. So that was a no-go, but he did pack up all the supplies on the new horses that he managed to get, and recruited 18 men, 2 women, with 2 of them, I guess, had wives, and said, well, I know I can't go back across here, and not with this many people, and I have to take this many people. I have to take all my supplies because I have to outfit this port. And he heads back this way over this horrible route. It didn't get too horrible route until he got, into the just before the Mojave Village. He had it pretty well straightened out. And then he gets here. And I think, again, his plan was not to try to cross the Mojave Desert, because by this time it's August and it's hot. And he knew from experience that he had a lot of men, a lot of horses, and trying to take them across there was not feasible. I think, again, that he was planning to go down the Colorado and then back up here, and then cross to Tehachapi Pass again, and then get his men on the Stanislaus, and then head over to the coast, possibly to Fort Ross, and head up. And in going to Fort Ross, he had told his men when he left them on the Stanislaus, hey, if I don't come back, go to Fort Ross. Well, they didn't know the true path of the Sacramento. And had you tried to go to Fort Ross, you would have been right here, and it would have been ugly. I'm not sure if you could get across the Sacramento at that point without a boat. You would have to go way north, crossing the tributaries, until you could get to a point where you could get across the Sacramento, then over to Fort Ross. But Smith didn't know that at the time. But down at the Mojave Villages, for some reason, as he's trying to cross and the Mojave are helping him, he is attacked and he loses half his men, all his horses, and most of his supplies. So his men have to go across the desert on foot with only what they could carry on their back. They had to go at night. It took them like 9 arduous days, made the way back up here to Cajon Pass or on the Mojave. But instead of going to Tehachapi, they went back to Cajon Pass because one of the men was injured, and plus they needed to get horses to make their way back up here. So they come back, they go to San Bernardino, and he's out. And now it's going to become evident that he had come back to California after being told not to. He knows he's busted, but he heads back up to the Tehachapi Pass, heads up to the Stanislaus, gets his men, and or reunites with his men. And then he goes over to San Jose to basically turn himself in. Or the other thing that he had in mind was that he wanted to take all the furs that they had gotten the year before and sell them to, say, a sea captain that was maybe going over to China, and take the money and buy new horses, more supplies, and then he could continue up the northern coast range. But first, he has to deal with Echeandia again. So he ends up having to go to Monterey, where Echeandia is, and he spends a lot of time trying to figure out how to get out of trouble and back on the road again. And he writes to Poinsett again. Did I mention he wrote to Poinsett the first time? He wrote to Poinsett the first trip, and that was in the Dale Morgan book. And so he writes to Poinsett again. Well, by the time Poinsett's got this, 5 minutes? Okay, I'm about there. Sorry, I know. I told you it was long. So by this time, Poinsett has pretty much given up on the treaty. He'd signed the new treaty with the same boundaries as in the Adams-Onis and boundary. They had made no progress on either acquiring this land or Texas. So Echeandia, I think he felt like or Smith felt like he could maybe salvage the trip if he bought some horses and took them back to the mountains where there was a short supply of horses, and at least he could do that. He could say that I explored the area east of San Francisco Bay, and I managed to bring a lot of horses back to my partners. So he talks Echeandia into letting him do that, and then he heads up over here. He crosses the San Joaquin, and he's heading up the west or the east side of the Sacramento River along the western flank of the Sierras, and he gets up to this pinch point here. And at that point, he writes in his memoir, and this is April 10th, 1828. I went advance of the party, and ascending a high point, took a view of the country and found the river coming from the northeast and running apparently for 20 to 30 miles through ragged and rocky hills. The mountain beyond appeared too high to cross at that season of the year, or perhaps at any other, believing it impossible to travel up the river. And that's where I left off. But look at how Weasley that language is. Running apparently. Mountains appeared, believing it impossible. That's classic confirmation bias. Seems like the thing to do there when you get in a tight spot, when you're trying to wrangle 250 wild horses, is you take a step back and say, what do I do? How do I get out of this? Well, his thought is, my only option is to go west to the coast. Gee, just where he wanted to go anyway. He didn't scout. Had he scouted, he probably could have found his way out through at least along the Pitt River, because we're pretty sure that Peter Skeen Ogden had taken that route a couple years later. Maybe not with so many horses, but it didn't seem to be a horrible way out. And then you basically cross the very edge of the Sierra right here into the Great Basin. Or had they looked, they might have found the foot trail that was probably the precursor of the trail that Ewing Young used to trail cattle up to the Willamette Valley. That couldn't have been too bad of a route out. He might have come up here and again found the Feather River and Beckworth Pass and then the Humboldt River. Would have taken him most of the way home. No, the only way he was going to get out, as far as he was concerned, was west. And so he reaches the Pacific, takes him 2 months to reach the Pacific, taking those horses across there. And he reaches it at Wilson Creek Beach on June 8th. And then he continues up the Pacific coast until he finally reaches the Umpqua River, and disaster, loses all but 3 of his men. And that's pretty much the end of his quest to find an overland route to the Pacific and establish an outpost there. So what would have happened had he actually been successful and gotten to the 1827 rendezvous and had achieved everything that he set out to achieve? Would it have mattered? I don't know, because like I said, Poinsett was not having any luck negotiating in Mexico. He was not a very good negotiator, and they just were dead set. They wanted all of the territory that Spain had been granted under the Adams-Onis Treaty. So he finally gets back to St. Louis back in 3031, and he does write the map. I mean, he prepares the map, he writes the memoir, and then he heads down to Santa Fe where he was killed. And that was pretty much the end of it. None of that information ever seemed to have been used to further the expansion of the US. But it does, this thought though, that that's what he was doing, does explain a lot of what would have been, what has been some really strange actions on his part. He was driven to succeed, and his decisions reflected the desire to do to further the expansion of his country. And I think that's it. Any questions?
Any questions?
Geographic findings. Who were the main people he was telling about this? Did he have people back in the United States government? Who were his main points of contact?
I'm convinced that Clark was behind it, and possibly Thomas Hart Benton.
And did any of those people have anything to do with Zebulon Pike's explorations in the Southwest?
I don't think so. Not that familiar with that exploration. At that point, Hart or Benton was a fairly new senator, because he was senator of a fairly new state. So we know what he had to do with abolishing the factory system, but that had been his achievements up till then.
Okay, just wondering.
Yes, in the beginning, you talked about Smith's connection with Ashley. But that's severed when Smith, Jackson, and Sublette bought out Ashley. And that was, 2 years prior to this expedition. So, I mean, do you think Ashley still was involved in the potential of these reports to go back to the U.S. Connections, or did he totally bow out of this thing?
So one thing that's kind of an enigma is that when Ashley sold out to Smith, Jackson, and Sublette, Smith had a lot more money in the game at that time, and there's no real explanation why. He was just a poor young man when he started out, and he had accumulated some salary in the 3.5 years, but so had Jackson and Sublette. And yet when when they sold out, Smith got a larger portion of the new business. He was credited as much as Jackson and Sublette combined. And why was that? There seemed to have been some kind of a financial deal. And I think that it probably had to do with Smith agreeing to undertake this expedition for Ashley. And like I said, Ashley was a politician.
Well, as far as the divvying up the funds, the way I understood it was it had to do what they were going to be doing in once they got to Santa Fe. But
I'm sorry, I can't quite hear you.
The division of the funds when they decided to in 1831 to go to Santa Fe, my understanding of one of the narratives is the way they divvied those funds between Smith, Jackson, and Sublette had to do with what was going to happen in Santa Fe. A couple of the guys, they had planned to do different, or I think they were thinking about dissolving the thing or doing something different. But anyway, I guess it really doesn't matter. It's just hard to understand how he was going to get anything done the way he was, and the communications and stuff. I'm a little confused about how this is all going to come together. I guess is my point.
All right. Thank you, Sheri. So that concludes all the forum journal talks. There's still programs. Bad Hand still has a program right now. The American Mountain Men have a couple programs this evening. There's campfire tonight, program tonight with the American Mountain Men. And then tomorrow morning, there's more programs. So please stick around and enjoy some more of the Rendezvous.